Hey there, Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain. It's time to push back against the nonsense that's written out there on the internet about me. This is a quote that is ascribed to me, and yeah, it sounds pretty bad. And the quote is this: I don't view humanity as a single species. This is how the quote goes. I don't view humanity as a single species. And what does that mean? Now, the first thing you'll note is that the quote ends with a ... which means, of course, that it's an incomplete thought, and that's your first context that you may not be getting the full picture of what I'm talking about. Now, species is a group of organisms with enough interrelated characteristics that they can breed and have viable offspring, and of course, that is all the races and ethnicities within humankind. So what am I talking about here? Well, this is put forward as some sort of racist statement, but where is it coming from? So the podcast is 2768. It's called Collective Guilt for Fun and Profit, and it is a Saturday call-in show from August the 9th, 2014. I'm going to play you the segment wherein the quote is. And so a young man called in. He wanted to talk about crime and punishment, specifically the death penalty and how prisons might work in a truly free society. And so we were talking about crime and punishment, and this is the context of what we're talking about here. He starts to talk about a man that he's heard of who was, I believe, a pedophile, and it talks about him in this way.
So he said in his conviction, he said that he was happy that they were going to put him away for 35 years because he was a enthusiastic and dedicated predator.
No restitution possible for the rape of a child. Or the murder of a child.
Right.
And but for certain ills, there is no restitution that is possible. Mm-hmm. And where restitution is impossible, forgiveness is impossible. And where forgiveness is impossible, it seems to me that incarceration, the isolation of the human virus from the community, is the right thing to do. I don't view humanity as a single species.
Okay, so we're talking about the predator-prey relationship between violent, destructive, rapey, murderous criminals and the general population. Now, I don't say humanity is not a single species, because that would be biologically and factually incorrect. So if I said anything about race, of course not. And using an analogy of predator-prey relationships to describe crime and punishment in human society. And that's it. There's nothing about race in this at all. So you can see the motives of the people who write this kind of stuff. These are the facts. This is my actual word. This is my actual voice.
This is regarding Gene Wars, our series on RK selection theory. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely something I recommend. He wrote in and said, given that there are gene wars going on, does it invalidate the non-aggression principle? The non-aggression principle doesn't work if it's not universal, and it's not universal because there are subspecies of humans in heavy opposition. We are not all the same, so why should the rules be extended across gene sets? And that's from Sam.
Just go watch Gene Wars. It's going to be a pretty important part of what we talk about in the show, is that brains are different. We don't all have sort of one sole brain that is roughly equivalent across the range. I mean, there are differences in intelligence, right? I mean, there's a bell curve of intelligence, and there's difference in ethnic levels of success on IQ tests. And so looking at human beings as one species is not biologically valid. We are a variety of subspecies, politically, ethnically sometimes, definitely in terms of gender, in terms of IQ, in terms of culture. These produce physical brain differences that are very hard to remediate when you get older. And so we are a cluster of genetics all fighting to reproduce their own particular genetics. Screaming racism at people because blacks are collectively less intelligent, screaming racism at people because Asians are collectively shorter, is insane. There are these gene sets, and the R versus K are gene sets that compete with each other. Human beings are the most K-selected species known to human beings, I guess. But even within humanity, there are different strategies of R versus K, which is what we're going to get into here.
And R versus K tend to prey upon each other. So you can think of R versus K as human subspecies that generally tend to displace each other. Now, Ks don't obviously prey literally upon Rs in humanity, but the gene sets both fight for survival using a variety of cultural and religious and political mechanisms, which is what we're going to get into here. So we have conservatives and we have liberals or left. I'm going to use left versus right because it's a bit more of a common way of looking at things. So if we look at our organisms, those who are on the left, well, our organisms have low investment in offspring. They generally avoid monogamy and pair bonding. So the quality of their offspring is relatively unimportant, whereas in the case of the K organisms, the quality really matters. And so babies are not precious. Yeah, you could just make another. They're just undifferentiated blobs. They're just blobs of cells in the R organism universe. And you have a very high sex drive, and you're going to have as many kids as you possibly can. And the parental preferences vastly outstrip the child preferences, right? Because parental preference is to go and have more kids. And so the R organisms, given that this characteristic tends to cluster itself on the left, is pro-choice and pro-abortion. And by that, I simply mean that they accept that abortion, like it's the woman's choice. It's the woman's choice. Parental preferences vastly outstrip the child's preferences. Of course, it's the baby's or the fetus's preference to be born, but it's the parent's preference that matters. And so this low value of offspring is one of the reasons why on the left they have less problem with abortion. And now, our organisms have little capacity to compete in the economic free market. Because they don't invest that much in their kids, and they generally grow up without fathers, which we'll get to in the single mom slide, and because they tend to, in general, be somewhat less complex and intelligent, and they don't have as much tribal sense in-group preferences, and they don't network as well, they have less capacity to compete in the economic free market. And so they prefer sexual liberty to economic freedom. You know, I'm not going to win in economics, but I'm really horny and want to have sex with a lot of different people, so I would love it if sexual restrictions were blown away. In the 1960s, you know, purely R-selected time in a lot of ways. They prefer sexual subsidies to low taxes, right? So if you're R-selected, you're probably not going to end up making a lot of money, so high taxes aren't a problem to you.
These are the facts. This is my actual word. This is my actual voice.